sponsored this event. The Unitarian, Universalist Social Justice Group here for sharing space. Hope Indivisible and Our Revolution have also been involved in publicizing it. So in these difficult times, community is so important. We are glad to have everyone together. So there's also a lot of events coming up, so I'm going to start with other ways to stay in community. I think we all need each other, and certainly there's a lot of need out there. So, in order of events, I believe, first of all, this Friday, we will be having our Gorman Road demonstration. So now going to be the first and third Fridays. For those of you who are not familiar with it, we are over Route 95 at rush hour on Friday with giant banners that say "Stop Separating Families." Hopefully soon to add "Where are the Children" banner. And we were out there last year from June until November every Friday. We think we hit about 60,000 vehicles. It's actually quite inspiring. Mostly we get a lot of honks and flashing lights and keeping this issue out there in the public eye and getting some pressure on our administration to be more humane. That's a nice way to say it. So please join us. We'd love to have you whatever time you come. And there are flyers in the back if you want to post it and bug your friends to join us. They are welcome. And then hold on, it's not my strength. May 18th, it was a Saturday at 2 o'clock at Elkridge Library. Our Revolution is bringing, it's going to be showing Shock and Awe. This is a movie about the journalists who uncovered that there really were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And one of the journalists will be coming to lead the discussion on kind of the lack of freedom of the press and the pressure that was put on them and their experience. So it should be a fantastic event. So if your name's on the email list, you should be getting information on that, but I just wanted to get that out there. We'll be publicizing it. Unitarians are also sponsoring that and Indivisible. So if you're on any of those lists, you'll be hearing about it. If not, make sure you sign up in the back. And then our really big project, and Nadine, I'm going to ask you to stand up. Where are you, Nadine? There she is. And this is the person really behind this project, so she deserves some credit. So please join me in thanking her. So we are the Children Project, many of you have heard of, but we will be on the National Mall on June 9th, International Children's Day, with 1,000 children's pajamas. We will be there as really bearing witness to the tragedy that's happening in this country and to the migrant families. We are looking for volunteers to help set up that event and to help monitor the event. We've got an endorsement from Elijah Cummings now, and it's really getting a lot of press. We will be also helping with the Unitarians and the American Friends Service Committee, United We Dream, with a petition at the event that will be coming out to your email soon. There's a plan to try to shut down the child detention center that's for profit, the largest one in Florida. And that same week that we'll be having our event, there's some senators that are going to be going to that, and will be kind of a kickoff event for you guys to stop this for-profit child detention. So we're excited to be a part of that and have all of you join us in whatever way you can. So please keep me your email. We have another event we need help with, so look at Lori over there.
On May 4th.
Right, come up here and read that.
You can.
Yeah, probably you're right.
Everybody can hear. Okay. On May 4th, that's this coming Saturday, FIRN, which is the Foreign Board Information and Referral Network of Howard County, is having its big fundraiser. It's a 5K fun run. It's at the Horowitz, and there'll be a lot of tables and events surrounding it. It starts at 9:30 in the morning. It's going to be at the Horowitz building at Howard County Community College. Indivisible Immigration Action Team is going to have a table. We're looking for volunteers to staff the table. I'm going to be handing out water to the runners, so I can't do it. So we need 2 or 3 people, and it's just a couple of hours. So So if anybody's interested, come see me afterwards, thanks.
All right, one more announcement. Jill's gonna tell us about an upcoming book, and then we're gonna introduce Leslie to come up here and introduce Dave. All right.
Hi, I just want to tell you about a book that actually came out about 10 days ago on the anniversary of the start of the violence in Nicaragua, which many of us here believe was an attempted coup, and I'm sure Dan will mention. He is also one of the authors of this book. This book is called Live from Nicaragua, Uprising or Coup. We have a few flyers left, but you can also just take a photograph of this. It's available for a free download as an e-reader or a PDF. And it's put out by about 20 activists and journalists who have either lived in Nicaragua or are living in Nicaragua now, who have a lot of in-depth, first-hand information about what happened in Nicaragua last year. It talks about the role of the church, about social media, about something that was mentioned here with another event about manipulation of mainstream media, and very good background to understand what happened in Nicaragua. It's very important for activists to understand about how social media and mass media were manipulated in Nicaragua, because this is something that's being used against social movements around the world. So I hope you'll take a look at the book and read also what our excellent speaker tonight, Dan, has written in this book.
It's so good to be back. My husband and I have started being officially snowbirds down in Florida for 3 months. If you are retired and you can do that, it's an amazing thing to take a break. But it's great to be back. It's good to see so many wonderful faces, and the struggle continues, and we just need to hold each other's hand and continue working. Friends of Latin America has been in this community for 34 years, and it is good in a way, but it's not good in the sense that things are still bad. And we need people's attention and we need your support. So this evening, this is part of the series that some of you had attended previously on Central America, Latin American issues. And today we are going to end that with a speaker. Our guest speaker tonight is Daniel Kovalik. The title of his talk is Understanding U.S. Intervention in Venezuela, Colombia, and Central America. As you will see, this is a very, very timely presentation because there is so little factual information that's being provided, even under the current environment. And we need, one of the things that Friends of Latin America has done is provide alternative information to help the people in the U.S. hear other stories, other voices that many times contradict what you're being told by the press, by the media. Because then we think that it's fair for you to make a choice and take a side on whose story you believe. And tonight, Daniel is a human rights lawyer who has dedicated his life to the defense of human rights, not only right here in the U.S., but also in Latin America, in particular in Colombia, South America. He has lived and volunteered in Nicaragua. It has been wonderful to meet him today. He was referred to me by an activist friend from Chicago, and here he is. He has defended the rights of Colombian union workers. So, his love for peace and justice does not end in our borders. And I think that's what we need to understand, that in order to have peace, you have to go beyond your borders. And we thank you very much for being here. We have some books from Daniel that are available tonight for sale. We hope that you purchase one, and he'll be talking about an upcoming book that will be on Venezuela, which is a very hard issue to understand because there is very little factual information about what is actually happening over there. Thank you very much for coming. With you, Daniel.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. We had a great dinner before this event, and a lot of us were reminiscing about our time, particularly in Nicaragua in the 80s. Can I see a show of hands, folks who might have been there in the 80s? Yeah, a number of people. If you were there in the 80s, it was a life-changing experience. One, to see what your country, the United States, was doing to such a poor country, terrorizing it. You know, the Contras were terrorists. Even our own Congress cut off aid twice to the Contras because of their terrorist activities against the population. They would attack doctors and clinics. They would go into people's houses. And I don't mean to, I'm quoting John Stockwell here, who was in the CIA, and as John Stockwell said in a tape that I used to listen to in college, he says, I don't mean to abuse you with verbal violence, but you need to know what your government and its agents are doing. And the Contras would go into houses and they would, before they killed the family, they would rape some of the people in the family, the parents maybe, in front of the children, or the children in front of the parents, and then they'd kill them. And the guy who helped fund the Contras at a time that Congress had cut off aid is now in charge of our policy towards Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, right? He went to jail for a brief time because he lied to Congress about his role in the Iran-Contra scandal. And then he was pardoned by George H.W. Bush. Now he's heading our policy towards Venezuela. To me, what else does one need to know about our policy towards Venezuela that he's heading in? Not only was he a part of the Iran-Contra scandal, he famously covered up the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador. I know you just showed the film Romero here, which I believe talks a bit about El Mozote. If you don't remember El Mozote, it happened in 1983, I believe. It was at 80? Yeah, that's right, because it was around the time Romero was killed. And troops that were funded and trained by the United States went into the community of El Mozote and surrounding community, and they killed around 1,000 people, mostly women and children, in a very short period of time. Well, Elliot Abrams was in charge of covering it up, and he told the press that couldn't have happened because there were only about 300 people even living in El Mozote. Remember that? Yeah. He also covered up the fact that the U.S. supported Guatemala at the time it was murdering its indigenous peoples in what is now recognized as a genocide. Even President Bill Clinton recognized that the U.S.-sponsored war in Guatemala was a genocide against the Mayan people. About 200,000 people were murdered in that war. If you want to call it a war, 94% of the people killed were killed by state forces. It's more of a turkey shoot. And again, Elliot Abrams was in charge of covering that up too and denying it. This is the guy who's going to bring democracy and human rights to Venezuela. It's the most implausible idea one could hold in their minds. It's not possible, right? Meanwhile, a senior Trump official recently said that U.S. sanctions against Venezuela were like Darth Vader's death grip against that country. What a pregnant statement that is. First of all, it reveals the fact that we're not a friend of the Venezuelan people. You wouldn't give the Vader death grip to your friends, right? We're trying to hurt them, and we are. There was a report that was just released last week by Mark Weisbrod of CEPR, but also Jeffrey Sachs one of the world-renowned economists from something called Goldman and Sachs. You might have heard of it before. Not a liberal institution. That concluded that the sanctions Trump imposed since August of 2017 have killed over 40,000 Venezuelans. And that more will die this year because of the sanctions. And yet people, including liberals of goodwill, believe that somehow Trump, who's not right on anything, who doesn't tell the truth about anything, is doing something good for Venezuela. These things are simply baffling to me. And so I want to talk about Venezuela primarily because they are in the immediate crosshairs of the United States. But I want to start that conversation by illustrating a point about how the U.S. propaganda model works. And it is the greatest propaganda model, the greatest propaganda system ever devised in the world, let me assure you of that. So, let me see a show of hot hands. Has anyone ever heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre? Okay, nearly everyone. It happened in 1989. And that event was followed every day in the press. And it was commemorated recently, the 25th anniversary. And they estimate, they don't know for sure, they estimate a wide range of people killed, 300 to 3,000 people. That's the official estimate. You can Google that if you want. Let me ask another question. How many people in the room have heard of the Caracazo? 1, 2. Okay. The Caracazo happened the same year as Tiananmen Square. And it happened in Venezuela. And this was prior to Chavez. The government, who had just been elected, had promised it would not give in to IMF austerity plans. And immediately upon being elected, the new president initiated IMF austerity plans, which raised the price of gasoline and therefore public transit by twice what it was. The people, as they did in China, rose up in protest. And the security forces of Venezuela acted with extreme prejudice against the protesters. And they killed 300 to 3,000 people. Same number. But in a country of about 25 million, China had 1 billion people. You can see the proportion isn't close. Meanwhile, what happened in China because of the Tiananmen Square massacre? Nothing. Life went on as usual. What happened in Venezuela? The rise of a guy named Hugo Chavez, who ended up liberating Latin America after 500 years of domination by Spain and the United States. And I don't say that, it's Noam Chomsky who said that. So you had an earth-shattering change in Venezuela from the Caracazo, with a hugely proportionate, greatly more proportional death toll than China. And yet how many of you commemorated the 25th anniversary of the Caracazo? How many of you have pictures of people standing in front of Venezuelan tanks in 1989? None of you, right? This is how the propaganda model works. If we don't like a country like China, we focus on their evils, their problems, their shortcomings. If we like a country like Venezuela at that time, because the president was in line with our austerity measures, we ignore their human rights violations. They're of no import to us. And that's happening now. The country with the very worst human rights, I can assure you, in all of this hemisphere, is the U.S.'s closest ally in Latin America, Colombia, South America. Right next door to Venezuela. I'll give you a few facts for you. Colombia has the largest internally displaced population in the world, even more than Syria, at over 8 million. Disproportionately indigenous and Afro-Colombian peoples who've been pushed off their land by military and paramilitary forces aligned with the United States. Colombia has more forcibly disappeared people than any country on earth. As of 2014, over 92,000 people have been forcibly disappeared in Colombia. You might have thought the world leader might have been Argentina famously in the 70s. They had 30,000 disappeared. Colombia's had 92,000 as of 5 years ago. Have folks heard about the false positive scandal in Colombia? Can I see a show of hands? False positive. I got 3. Between 2002 and 2010, the high watermark of U.S. military aid to Colombia, the Colombian military, by its own admission now, it doesn't deny it, murdered 10,000 civilians. Dressed them up in guerrilla uniforms and passed them off as guerrillas to justify military support from the United States at $10 billion. This is a human rights crisis. I went to the town of Buenaventura about 1.5 years ago in Colombia. It's a big port town on the Pacific coast. Colombia is a very fascinating country. It has 70 different ethnic groups, very rich in ethnicity and biodiversity. On the Pacific coast, you have a large Afro-descendant population, which you might not have known. If you go to Buenaventura, if someone dropped you there, you didn't know where you were, you might think you were in Haiti, maybe Africa. It's mostly Afro-Colombian people. It's also one of the most oppressed cities in the world. You can look up a number of Human Rights Watch reports that talk about the disappeared people in Buenaventura. And the chop houses run by the death squads in Buenaventura, where they cut people up alive with machetes and chainsaws. Hundreds of people. These are death squads aligned with the military that the U.S. funds. And yet this is of no import. You will not read about this in the New York Times. You're not going to read about it in the Washington Post. You're not going to hear about it on NPR. This is of no importance. As Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman have pointed out, there are 2 kinds of victims in the world: worthy victims and unworthy victims. Worthy victims are those who are victimized by our adversaries and our enemies. So every day you will hear something bad about Venezuela or Nicaragua, right? Or Iran or China or Russia. But you won't hear about the chop houses in Buenaventura or the 150 social leaders killed in the last year in Colombia, South America. Or the Wayu people, the largest indigenous tribe in Colombia, that live on the border of Venezuela. And they're dying of thirst and hunger. I visited that tribe 2 years ago. And they took me to the river that used to feed their community. And we stood right in the middle of it because there's no water in that river. A mining company owned by Canadian and U.S. and South African interests have dammed up their river. According to official estimates, 4,000 children of the Wayu have died due to starvation in the last years. According to the YU, 14,000 children have died. And yet there's no humanitarian aid being brought to them by the U.S. in this well-publicized event. Richard Branson is not holding a benefit concert for them. We are being lied to. Meanwhile, Venezuela, the U.S. is starving that country. As I mentioned, Jeffrey Sachs, a fairly conservative economist, has estimated in just a year and a half, 40,000 people in Venezuela have died due to our sanctions. Recently, Trump announced even greater sanctions this year, in which he said, look, Citgo, you ever seen a Citgo gas station? It's a Venezuela's U.S. oil company. They can feel free to sell the U.S. as much gasoline as they want, no problem. But none of the money will go back to Venezuela. The U.S. has seized over $7 billion of their oil. They've stolen it. $5 billion of that was earmarked for medicine and food to be imported to Venezuela. Yeah. So we'll steal $5 billion from you for your food and medicine, but we'll offer you $20 million in this ridiculous attempt to bring aid to Venezuela, which even the International Red Cross said was not a humanitarian gesture. And you might recall that of the 4 aid trucks that were to go into Venezuela, 2 were set on fire. Do you remember this? Who did it? Do you remember? They claim Maduro's forces did it. 2 weeks later, the New York Times said, sorry, it was our people who did it. Did you see that retraction 2 weeks later? Not many people did. Because CNN at the time said, we saw Maduro's people do it. They couldn't have because they didn't do it. It was a lie. And everyone reported it. NPR reported it. Everyone said Maduro's people set fire to the aid trucks. Meanwhile, people like Max Blumenthal, who were there, videotaped what happened. It was very clear the trucks were set on fire from the Colombia side, not the Venezuelan side. Took 2 weeks for the Times to correct it. By the time they did, everyone forgot about it. Very few outlets reported on that correction. And so you're left with that stench in your nose that Maduro set fire to aid. It's a lie. You were being lied to. Just as you were lied to justify the war in Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction which never existed. And even if they had, they would have come from us, right? Because we supported Hussein during his very worst years, including with chemical weapons. The Gulf of Tonkin, you remember that? The lie that justified the massive congressional support for the war in Vietnam. Remember the main Spanish-American War? Looks like that probably blew up from the inside from a boiler explosion, not from the Spanish. Time and again, we're lied into war, and yet every time we believe it. How is that possible? You know, I remember the Who song, We Won't Be Fooled Again. In fact, our theme song should be, We Will Be Fooled Again. Do you remember Libya? You know, even Democracy Now! Supported the Libya invasion. It's the quickest humanitarian intervention you'll ever see. The uprising in Libya took place in February. February 2011. By March, NATO was bombing. It's the quickest humanitarian war you will ever see. And it was based on lies. And there are 3 main lies, and I think they're relevant here. Because people forget or never knew that they were lies. 2 were bad enough, but the 3rd was the worst of all. So first of all, the interesting thing we need to keep in mind is that the war in Libya which was done by Obama, Saint Obama, right? Barack Obama, who most of us regard as a holy man and better than Trump and all that. It was his war. Let's be clear about that. And there were 3 lies that justified it. And the people who pushed the war were Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power. And Samantha Power is an interesting person because if you know anything about her, she was Obama's ambassador to the United Nations, right? But how did she get that job? She wrote a book that won the Pulitzer Prize called A Problem from Hell, and it was about genocide. And she wrung her hands, I don't know, you tell me what you know. Wrung her hands about genocide and how the West always turned its face away from genocide and didn't stop it. But the interesting thing about that 1,000-page book is she never talks about the times the West actually committed the genocide. She doesn't mention Vietnam, where the U.S. kills 2 to 4 million Vietnamese. She doesn't mention Guatemala, where the U.S. aided and abetted genocide. She doesn't mention the Congo, where Bill Clinton supported the murders of 6 million Congolese. Do you remember that? Remember the 6 million Congolese who died after 1996? Of course you don't, because you weren't told about it. Interestingly, it was Samantha Power that pushed us to invade Libya to prevent genocide. In fact, what she helped do was create a genocide, and I'll tell you how. So there were 3 lies. One, which I literally laughed at when I heard it because it seemed so implausible, was that Muammar Gaddafi was handing out Viagra to his troops so they could engage in mass rapes. Some of us rightfully laughed at that, but the news, our papers of record, like the New York Times, reported it with tongue not in cheek. Well, that turned out to be a lie. Amnesty International and others said there was no evidence of this. The second lie was that Gaddafi was going to commit a genocide in Benghazi. There was no evidence of this. In fact, Gaddafi offered at the UN to allow the UN to go to Benghazi and see for themselves that this was not going to happen. And the UN, again, with Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power, at the Security Council, at their insistence, the UN never did that. But the third lie was the worst of all. Hillary Clinton et al. Claimed that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries against the Libyan people. Why it was important they were black, I don't know. But the point was that they claimed Gaddafi was bringing in people, mercenaries from Africa, to carry out human rights abuses in Libya. And do you know how they said you could tell who the black mercenaries were? From their yellow hard hats. Yeah, they were construction workers. All the human rights groups would later say this was a lie, that these black mercenaries were immigrant workers that Gaddafi let work in Libya. But that lie did a couple horrible things. One, it allowed or justified the war of NATO in Libya. But 2, it justified the genocide against black Africans in Libya that followed that invasion. Because the jihadists that we supported in Libya then went after the black mercenaries. There were whole African towns that were destroyed after NATO got its way in Libya. Blacks were arrested, they were killed, and you know what's happening to them now, right? they were being auctioned off as slaves. And that's in mainstream press. That's not a controversial statement. There are now slave markets in Libya, thanks to Obama and Clinton and Samantha Power, the genocide queen. The other thing Samantha Power did, by the way, which was fascinating, was at the Security Council in 2015, there was a move early on to put the brakes on the Saudi war in Yemen. And there was a move to start investigations of war crimes in Yemen. And Samantha Power, who now lives in Boston happily, you can go to her Twitter feed and learn about her kids who play soccer and about how much she loves the Red Sox. She, at the Security Council, made sure that that investigation never went forward. And Obama would go forward and give billions of dollars in military aid to Saudi Arabia to begin the war in Yemen, which continues to this day. And which, according to the UN, will kill 10 million Yemenis. 10 million by the end of the year. That's your tax dollars at work. And yet we're going to save people in Venezuela. It's a joke. It is a sick joke. And it is the reason these things can happen that make no sense at all is because we have a bad religion in this country that nearly everyone believes in on some level. And it's called American exceptionalism. And it's the belief that has no basis in fact or proof that the U.S. is a force for human rights, for democracy, and good in the world. And there is no evidence of this whatsoever. The one thing, of course, the U.S. did do, they played a very nice supporting role to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics during World War II in defeating the Nazis. Of course, the Red Army did most of the work, killed 90% of the Germans. So the U.S. helped. Besides that, you can't point to one good thing the U.S. has done with its wars around the world. And yet there is this belief that the 82nd Airborne is a human rights organization. I can assure you it is not. But many liberals believe this. I mean, one of the proof of this is that the only time Trump was deemed presidential, even by the New York Times, was when he was bombing Syria. Do you remember that? There was an alleged chemical attack in Syria, and I say alleged because there's a lot of evidence that if it happened, it wasn't by Assad. But he, in retaliation, bombed targets near the Syrian capital of Damascus. And that was the one time he was considered presidential, because you're not a president unless you're bombing someone. And I would say, I've already given the Darth Vader analogy, I would say search your feelings for this, as to whether you think in your